Hello, History of Medicine students. This is Professor Bowen here with my Week 2 comment response video. We had a lot of great discussions last week, and I hope that you learned a lot of interesting things about medicine in ancient Greece. I found our discussions of the medical marketplace particularly fascinating, and I wanted to address some of the comments that came out of this, particularly the question of whether or not using the Hippocratic Corpus helps us foreground the place of patients, by which I mean the sick and the suffering, within ancient Greek medical encounters. After reading Hippocratic texts like Decorum, Physician, Precepts, and Prognosis, most of you responded to this question in the negative, arguing that it's pretty hard and perhaps even impossible to use these texts to write a patient-centered history of ancient Greek medicine. As many of you observed, correctly, I think, even when Hippocratic healers discussed the different techniques they practiced in order to attract patients, we're still not learning about patients themselves. As the authors of these texts, doctors were in control of their contents, and even when reporting on the various sick people they treated, it seems like everything we learn about the patients comes to us through the mediated voice of the healer. So, are the sick inaccessible to us then? Is the only view we can see from the physician's view? For a long time, historians have been trying to develop techniques to help us learn about how past generations of humans experienced illness, how they experienced their bodies, and what it was like to be a sick man, woman, or child. Their attempts to uncover the patient's perspective have come at a time when, increasingly, modern medicine itself is moving toward a more patient-centered form of medical practice, a phenomenon that can be seen in the rise of what is called narrative-based medicine, and in the growing recognition that there is often a big difference between medically defined illness and what anthropologist Arthur Kleinman has called illness as lived experience. Another way we can see these changes is through the rising prominence of palliative care, an area of healthcare that focuses on the relief of patients' suffering, however patients define that suffering. Historians have been part of these developments, and their work has contributed to the emergence of a more patient-centered style of clinical care. It is because of these things that historians today attach great importance to foregrounding the patient as a key actor within the medical drama. How do sick people experience and interpret pain? How do they communicate their sufferings to others? And in what circumstances do they seek help? How do they interact with medical practitioners? And how do their views of illness compare to those of medical experts? All of these questions really, really matter because all of them influence the progression of illness and the overall healing process. But to get to them, we need to de-emphasize the authority and perspective of medical practitioners and look more at sick people as agents, as sources of knowledge, and as voices that are a key part of medicine. But again, how do we do this exactly? Specifically, how do we do it for the ancient world? In more recent history, one could recover the patient's perspective by looking at personal letters, correspondences, autobiographies, memoirs, diaries, and other first-person illness narratives. All of these can provide us with more or less unfiltered representations of patienthood, and because of this, they are incredibly valuable. Unfortunately, for the ancient world, patient narratives like this simply do not exist. So, how do we shift the focus from doctors to lay people and the subjective experiences of sufferers? What other kinds of sources could help us do ancient medical history from below? One innovative solution that has been proposed for recovering the patient's marginalized voice is to look at case histories. This kind of evidence we actually do have in abundance. For example, the Hippocratic text called Epidemics contains reports on a number of different individual cases, which not only include patients' names, but also some fascinating details about their lives. In what follows, I wanted to share some information with you about this book, Epidemics, and about what we can learn from it regarding the social world of the sick person in ancient Greece. So first, a little bit of background information. There are actually 7 different books called Epidemics in the Hippocratic Corpus. All of them were written between the 5th and 4th centuries BC, and historians simply number them 1 through 7. The titles of these books originally meant visit, and basically, what they do is talk about doctors making visits to patients, observing their symptoms, recording their treatments, and evaluating the effects of these. In other words, these are physicians' notebooks. Most Hippocratic doctors were itinerants. They spent their days journeying across the Aegean Sea, stopping at various ports of call in mainland Greece and Asia Minor to treat patients. They typically spent weeks or sometimes months in a given location, and frequently they would return to a patient's house multiple times to treat them before moving on. They could visit them every day, and sometimes even more than once per day. Even though these sources are not autobiographical, they're not first-hand accounts from patients, they also are not totally dismissive of the patient's view. Indeed, we can read these texts as the result of a dialogue, of a long-lasting dialogue between different voices, including the doctors who wrote the reports, the patients who they treated, and also other individuals like the patient's friend and or relatives, and other healers who may have been present. In many ways, the sufferer's experience and subjective viewpoints are visible in these reports. They are like the substructure on which the doctor narrates the case. As one historian who has studied the Hippocratic Corpus puts it, quote, "No patient history can really be written despite the patient or entirely over his or her head." The case reports included in Epidemics have a fairly standard format. Most of them begin with anamnesis, which is a fancy word for case history. In this section, doctors often mention the patient's name, their family connections, and sometimes even list their address and the time of the year. The qualitative comments indicate that often patients were on very familiar terms with their doctors. For example, a case report from Epidemics 2 begins by noting that the patient is, quote, "the wife of the leather worker who made my shoes." Another patient is identified as, quote, "the pretty virgin, the daughter of Nereus." In addition to this, in the anamnesis section, doctors provide information on the patient's past, specifically past illnesses. Obviously, these were things that the physician could not learn about without asking the patient directly. So in this section, we frequently hear the patient's voice coming through. Of course, doctors did not quote their patients. They didn't try to recover exactly what they were saying, but still, they summarized their statements. Consider this as an example. It's an excerpt from Epidemics 5. So, one of the interesting things these examples reveal is that Hippocratic doctors sometimes doubted what their patients were saying. For example, in Epidemics 4, a doctor recounts something a female patient told him about her difficulties getting pregnant. Quote, "She said that she had lost another, a male, towards the 20th day. Whether it was true, I don't know." In another similar case, a doctor wrote that, quote, "The woman in Tenedos aborted on the 4th day, or so she said." These passages point to doctors' beliefs that their patients' statements were sometimes unreliable or suspect. In other words, patients and their doctors were sometimes might have seen things quite differently. We can see this in the way that doctors used verbs like seemed, or appeared to be, or felt. Like in an excerpt from Epidemics 5, when a doctor wrote of how, quote, "Damocles appeared to be blurred in vision and slacken in the body." Or in Epidemic 7, when a doctor says this of a patient, "Whenever he vomited, he seemed easier." There is, within these reports, then, a kind of two-way traffic. It's a two-way street between the ones who suffer and the ones who cure. The patient's own subjective viewpoint comes out most notably in cases involving psychological or emotional distress. For example, in Epidemic 7, we learn of a man who said, quote, that he did not want to go out, but he said he was afraid. If someone spoke to him about severe diseases, he would withdraw in fear. He said sometimes that heat fell on his hypochondria and that sparks before his eyes continued. Another thing we learn is that the medical encounter was not solely between doctors and patients. Family and friends of the patient were also closely involved. In the case of the daughter of a woman named Euryonyx, the doctor writes that, quote, they said that she suffered after eating grapes. It's not exactly clear who the they in this statement is, but it's clearly neither the doctor nor the patient. It's someone else who knows about her condition. The contributions of relatives can also be seen in a passage from Epidemics 5, where we learn of a man who appears to have been attended to by numerous others, for the doctor writes that, quote, in sleep he did not seem to those who were present to be breathing, but to have died. He perceived nothing, speech or action, and his body was stretched out and rigid. All of these examples make clear that physicians' notebooks constitute an important source for doing a patient-centered history of medicine. The Hippocratic Corpus, it appears, is not blind to the sick person's point of view. Even when trying to fill their writings with their own voices, doctors cannot write about someone else's suffering without making space for that individual's voice. And what that means is that books like Epidemics actually allow us to do something really important in this field, and for healthcare more generally. All right, I think I'll leave it there for now. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you found it informative and enjoyable. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments feed or to get in touch with me via email or Telegram. I look forward to continuing our journey through the history of medicine together, and we'll see you all in our virtual classrooms real soon. Bye-bye for now.